We threw her into the iron pits as a common traitor, never imagining she was the secret princess of a forgotten line. Calithea Nocturne stood in the grime of the dungeon, her wrists bound in cold iron, yet her eyes held the fire of 1,000 suns. To the guards she was merely a rogue who had dared to defy the crown. To the dying King Vaelor she was supposed to be his final execution before he succumbed to the shadows. But as Vaelor's cursed skin met hers, the air didn't fill with the scent of death. It ignited with the gold of 1,000 dawns. The prisoner they scorned was not a criminal. She was the fated heart needed to mend his fractured soul. Chapter 1. The iron pits of the Grimhowl Pack were not merely a prison. They were a geological throat designed to swallow the hope of any who dared defy the Alpha King. Carved into the jagged roots of a mountain that bled black soot and sulfur, the pits were a labyrinth of rusted cages and mud-slicked trenches where the sun was a forgotten myth. On this day, the air was particularly thick with the metallic tang of blood and the low rhythmic growl of the shadow beasts that prowled the perimeter. Into this sunless hell, Calithea Nocturne was dragged, her wrists bound in shackles of cold iron that hummed with a dampening spell meant to crush the spirit of the low-born rebels. The guards, hulking men in scarred leather who smelled of stale ale and violence, shoved her forward with a brutality that would have broken a lesser woman. They saw only a rogue, a nameless girl caught on the fringes of the blackthorn woods, dressed in rags that clung to her lean frame. They mocked her silent resilience, mistaking her poise for the arrogance of a common thief who had yet to realize the finality of her situation. As she stumbled through the slush of the upper tier, the chains rattled against the stones, but Calithea did not utter a sound. Her eyes, wide and luminous even in the gloom, scanned the descent with a terrifying calm that made the lead guard, a man whose face was a map of old tavern brawls, pause for a fraction of a second. He felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, a sensation like standing too close to a lightning strike, but he dismissed it with a sharp kick to her calves. As they descended deeper into the iron pits, the atmosphere shifted from mere cruelty to something primal and electric. The prisoners in the surrounding cages, hardened killers, political dissidents, and starving scavengers, began to press their faces against the bars. A low murmur rippled through the darkness, a tide of whispers that followed Calithea's path. Even through the filth and the grime that matted her dark hair, there was a shimmer about her, a subtle golden translucence that the shadows could not quite penetrate. It wasn't a light that illuminated the room, but a glow that seemed to radiate from her very marrow, a pulsing heat that made the cold iron of her shackles hiss where it touched her skin. The agitation among the inmates grew with every step she took. The shadow beasts, creatures of pure void matter used to keep the prisoners in a state of constant terror, began to whine and retreat into the corners of their kennels. Their yellow eyes, usually fixed on the scent of fear, blinked in confusion as they caught the scent of the Solaris Line, a scent like crushed jasmine and sun-warmed stone. To the guards, it was just the smell of a woman who had yet to be broken by the pits, but to the prisoners, it was a vibration that stirred long-buried memories of a kingdom that existed before the Grimhowls brought the darkness. "Down you go, rebel," the guard spat, unlatching a heavy iron grate that led to the lowest, most damp cell in the sector. He shoved her inside, the floor a mix of standing water and sharp shale. "The Alpha King has enough problems with the rot without little rats like you causing trouble in the woods. You'll stay here until the Duke decides whether you're worth the rope or just a quick throat cut." Calithea landed on her knees, the impact jarring through her spine, yet she did not collapse. She rose slowly, her movements possessed of a royal fluidity that felt entirely out of place in the mud. As the guard slammed the grate shut and turned the heavy brass key, the golden aura around her flared for a heartbeat, a flash of brilliance that reflected off the rusted bars and illuminated the guard's face in a terrifying ethereal light. He stumbled back, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't name. Calithea looked at him then, her gaze level and unnerving. She didn't speak, for her voice was a weapon she wasn't yet ready to reveal, but the shimmer beneath her skin intensified. The shackles on her wrists began to glow a dull, cherry red as her internal heat fought the dampening magic. The guard didn't stay to hear an answer. He turned and fled up the stone stairs, his boots splashing through the muck, leaving the low-level rogue in a cell that was rapidly losing its darkness. In the silence of the pit, the other prisoners fell into an expectant hush. They watched the girl in the crimson-stained rags, seeing the way the water at her feet began to steam. They saw the prisoner they were supposed to scorn, but they felt a power that demanded they kneel. Calithea closed her eyes, leaning her head against the freezing stone wall. She felt the weight of the blight pressing down from the castle far above, a rotting, stagnant curse that she had been born to mend. She was the secret princess of a line scrubbed from the history books, a fated savior thrown into the iron pits by the very man who was dying for her touch. The deception was complete. To the world she was a traitor caught in the act of rebellion. But as the iron bars groaned under the pressure of her rising heat, Calithea Nocturne knew that the pits wouldn't hold her for long. The Alpha King was coming, driven by a pull he wouldn't understand, and when he arrived the iron would melt, the darkness would break, and the girl in the pits would become the only thing standing between the Grimhowls and the void. Hit that subscribe button if you are hooked in, like, share and comment your thoughts on this story. Thank you. Chapter 2. Above the sulphurous damp of the iron pits, the high spires of the Grimhowl citadel pierced the clouds like broken teeth, yet within the royal sanctum, the air was thicker with the scent of death than in any dungeon. Alpha King Vaelor sat upon a throne of dark, gnarled wood, his body a battlefield where the blight of the void was winning its slow, agonizing war. The curse was not a simple illness of the blood. It was a sentient rot, a creeping ink that moved beneath his skin like a nest of shadow vipers. It clawed at his joints and whispered cold, hollow promises of oblivion into his mind. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of obsidian, and every heartbeat sent a pulse of liquid ice through his veins, threatening to crack his very soul. Vaelor's appearance, once the symbol of the pack's unyielding primal strength, had become a haunting tapestry of the macabre. His hair, the color of moonlight on a winter lake, fell in tangled disarray over shoulders that felt weighted by the leaden gravity of the abyss. His amber eyes, the true mark of the Grimhowl Alphas, were now shot through with veins of unnatural violet, a testament to the darkness eating him from the inside out. He gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white as a fresh wave of agony rippled across his chest. Beneath the fine silk of his tunic, he could feel the skin beginning to flake away, leaving behind a charcoal-black decay that resisted every tincture and spell known to the kingdom. Across the dimly lit chamber Rook Ironvale, the captain of the Shadow Guard, paced with the restless energy of a caged predator. Rook was more than a soldier. He was Vaelor's shadow, a man whose loyalty was etched into his bones. His own face was drawn, his eyes weary from weeks of sleepless vigils and failed hunts for a miracle. He watched his king wither, feeling the tremors of the kingdom's stability shaking with every shudder of Vaelor's breath. If the Alpha fell, the Grimhowl Pack would tear itself apart, and Duke Iskarn stood waiting in the wings like a vulture over a dying lion. "The healers from the southern reach have fled, sire," Rook said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the crackle of the green-flamed hearth. "They claim the blight is beyond the reach of the earthly elements. They speak of ancient sins and blood debts that cannot be repaid with gold or prayer." Vaelor let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan, a dry, rattling noise that pained his throat. "Sins? My only sin was holding this kingdom together while the void tried to tear the sky open. Tell me, Rook, is there any truth to the rumors? Is the land truly dying with me?" Raiden hesitated, his hand tightening on the hilt of his black iron blade. "The forests of the Blackthorn are graying. The game has fled. The pack senses the vacuum, Vaelor. They feel the rot in the soil. Without a mending, the Grimhowl legacy ends with the next moon." The king closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold wood. In the darkness of his mind, the void beckoned. It was a vast, silent ocean of nothingness, and he was a drowning man. He felt the fractured pieces of his soul drifting apart, the primal bond that connected him to his people fraying like old rope. He was an alpha who could no longer lead, a protector who was himself a source of contagion. "Find me something, Rook," Vaelor whispered, the command barely audible. "Not a healer. Not a priest. Find me a miracle, or find me a blade sharp enough to end this before I turn into a monster of shadow." Rook bowed his head, the desperation in his chest a physical weight. He had scoured the archives, sent spies into the forbidden territories, and even consulted the outcasts of the fringe. He had found nothing but whispers of a Solaris Line, a royal bloodline that supposedly possessed the light of the sun itself, but they had been purged centuries ago, their memory buried under the heels of the Alphas. Yet as he watched Vaelor, he felt a sudden, inexplicable pull toward the lower levels of the citadel. It wasn't a thought but a vibration. A faint, humming warmth that seemed to call to the very darkness infecting the king. "There is a prisoner," Rook began, his voice uncertain. "A girl brought in from the Blackthorn fringes. The guards speak of a strange aura. They say the iron in the pits is reacting to her." Vaelor didn't open his eyes, but a flicker of interest crossed his pained features. The void within him hissed at the mention of her, a reaction of pure instinctive loathing that usually signaled a threat to its dominion. For the first time in weeks, a spark of the old, predatory king stirred. "A prisoner," Vaelor breathed. "In the iron pits? If she has a spark of life left in her, perhaps she has something the void fears." "I will bring her to you, sire," Rook said, his pace quickening toward the door. "No," Vaelor commanded, his amber eyes snapping open, burning with a violet-tinged ferocity. "I will go to her. If I am to die in the dark, I want to see the face of the girl who makes the iron hiss." As the king stood, his body trembling with the effort of defying the curse, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and claw at his heels. Rook moved to support him, but Vaelor pushed him away with a stubborn pride. They began the slow descent from the height of the citadel toward the suffocating depths of the iron pits. With every step downward, the agony in Vaelor's chest intensified, the rot sensing an approaching enemy. But beneath the pain there was a new sensation, a distant golden hum that promised either his salvation or his absolute destruction. The Alpha King moved toward the pits not as a sovereign going to judge a rebel, but as a starving man moving toward a flicker of light. He did not know that the girl in the shackles was the secret princess of the sun, nor did he know that the touch he sought would ignite a fire that would either heal his soul or burn the entire kingdom to ash. He only knew that for the first time since the curse began, the void was afraid. Chapter 3. The descent into the iron pits felt like a journey through the gullet of a dying god. Every step Vaelor took down the winding, narrow stone stairs sent a jolt of agony through his marrow, the blight within him reacting violently to the deepening gloom. Rook Ironveil followed a step behind, his hand hovering near the king's shoulder, his shadow flickering against the damp walls in the sickly green light of the torches. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of wet iron and the stale, airless breath of the condemned, yet the deeper they sank, the more Vaelor felt a discordant hum in his bones, a vibration that was not the cold, hollow rattle of the void, but something sharp, resonant, and disturbingly warm. The guards at the lowest tier scrambled to their feet, their faces turning the color of ash as the Alpha King emerged from the shadows. They had never seen the sovereign in the pits. He was a figure of the high spires and the open moon, not the subterranean filth. Vaelor ignored their clumsy salutes, his violet-tinged eyes fixed on the heavy iron grate at the end of the corridor. The atmosphere here was different. The shadow beasts that usually paced the bars were silent, huddled in the back of their kennels with their tails tucked, their whimpers the only sound in the oppressive quiet. "Open it," Vaelor commanded, his voice a rasping growl that cost him a surge of pain in his chest. The lead guard fumbled with the keys, the metal clattering against the stone floor before he managed to turn the lock. The grate groaned open, revealing a cell that should have been a pitch-black tomb. Instead it was filled with a soft amber luminescence that seemed to bleed from the very cracks in the walls. At the center of the mire stood Calithea. He did not look like a prisoner. Even in her mud-stained rags, with the iron shackles weighing down her slender wrists, she stood with a poise that defied the gravity of the pit. Her eyes met Vaelor's, amber meeting violet, and for a heartbeat the king felt the rot within him recoil, a physical sensation of the darkness pulling back as if burned. Vaelor stepped into the cell, the slush splashing against his boots. He felt the weight of Rook's concern behind him, but he pushed it away. He was the Alpha, and even as he felt his soul fracturing, he would not be cowed by a girl in chains. He moved closer, the heat radiating from her skin becoming an almost physical pressure against his cold, decaying limbs. It was the scent of the blackthorn woods in high summer, a smell of life so potent it made his head swim with a nauseating longing. "They tell me you are a rebel," Vaelor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low velvet. He moved into her personal space, his height looming over her, trying to find the fear he expected. "They tell me the iron hisses when you touch it. I find myself wondering if you are a revolutionary, or merely a witch sent by my enemies to finish what the void started." Calithea did not flinch. He did not even blink. Her silence was a roar that irritated his pride. "Speak," he hissed, the violet veins in his neck bulging. "Tell me your name before I decide that the pits are too comfortable for you." Still she remained silent, her gaze tracing the blackened, necrotized skin creeping up from his collar. There was no pity in her expression, only a profound, ancient recognition that infuriated him. In a sudden flash of primal frustration, a need to assert dominance over the thing that dared to be warm while he was freezing, Vaelor reached out. He caught her forearm in a crushing grip, intending to jerk her toward the light and force a confession from her lips. The moment his fingers clamped onto her skin, the world exploded into a silent, blinding gold. It wasn't a spark, it was a conflagration. At the point of contact, Calithea's skin didn't just glow, it ignited with the brilliance of 1,000 dawns. The cold iron shackles around her wrists turned white-hot and shattered, the metal turning to dust as the Solaris magic surged through her veins to meet his darkness. Vaelor let out a strangled cry, but he could not let go. It felt as though he had plunged his hand into the heart of a star. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. As her golden light collided with his violet rot, a shockwave of purity rippled up his arm. The blight of the void shrieked in his mind, a chorus of 1,000 dying shadows as it was forcibly purged from his limb. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, the constant grinding pain in his chest vanished. The liquid ice in his veins turned to molten fire, and the weight on his soul lifted as if the very mountains had been removed from his shoulders. Vaelor gasped, his knees buckling as the sheer relief of the healing overwhelmed his senses. He didn't fall, he hung there, his hand still fused to her arm by a bridge of light. He watched in breathless awe as the charcoal-black decay on his hand retreated, replaced by healthy, vibrant flesh. The violet veins in his eyes cleared, returning to the piercing, predatory amber of the Grimhowl Line. Calithea looked down at him, her aura now a halo of shimmering gold that turned the iron pit into a cathedral of light. Her secret bloodline had reacted instinctively to his curse, the Solaris power sensing the void and rising to annihilate it. In that high-stakes contact, the deception was stripped away. She wasn't a rogue. She wasn't a rebel. She was the mending the world had forgotten. Rook Ironvale stood paralyzed at the cell door, his hand on his sword, his jaw dropped in disbelief. He saw his king, a man who had been a walking corpse moments ago, breathing deeply, the color returning to his face, his posture regaining its lethal grace. He saw the girl, her rags falling away to reveal a radiance that no dungeon could contain. Vaelor slowly looked up at her, his grip softening but his hand refusing to break the connection. The silence in the cell was no longer heavy. It was electric, charged with a magnetic, fated tension that made his heart beat with a rhythm he thought he had lost forever. He looked at her not as a prisoner but as his only salvation. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice no longer a rasp, but a rich, resonant baritone that vibrated through the small space. Calithea finally spoke, her voice like the chime of a silver bell in the dark. "I am the end of your winter, Vaelor Grimhowl." The king did not pull away. Instead, he reached up with his other hand, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch didn't just mend his skin. It began to stitch together the fractured pieces of his soul. In the depths of the iron pits, amidst the mud and the chains, a reluctant romantic spark was struck. A bond forged in the fire of the sun and the shadows of the void. The prisoner he had come to interrogate had just become the woman who held his life, and the destiny of the entire kingdom in her glowing hands. Chapter 4. The golden brilliance that had scorched the damp air of the iron pits had faded into a shimmering residual hum, but the silence it left behind in the citadel was far louder than any scream. While the Alpha King was escorted upward, not by the dragging weight of his curse, but by a newfound terrifying vitality, Rook Ironvale did not follow the sovereign to the royal baths. Instead, the captain of the Shadow Guard turned toward the deepest bowels of the great library, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He carried a secret he could barely articulate, the image of a girl whose blood had recognized a king's darkness and burned it away with the authority of a star. Rook bypassed the public scrolls and the maps of conquest, descending until the air grew dry and smelled of dust that had settled before the first Grimhowl took the throne. The restricted vaults were a tomb of memories, guarded by locks that required the blood of an alpha's most trusted kin. With a jagged slice across his palm, Rook offered the sacrifice to the iron door, and the stone groaned open, exhaling a breath of forgotten centuries. He moved past the genealogies of the Wolf Lords and the histories of the Great Purges, searching for the sigil he had seen etched into the girl's very spirit, a sunburst entwined with thorns. In the flickering light of his lantern, Rook pulled a heavy leather-bound volume from a shelf that had been intentionally obscured by webbing. The annals of the Solaris were supposed to have been destroyed during the Age of Eclipse, yet here they were, the forbidden record of the line that preceded the Alphas. As he turned the parchment, his eyes widened. The text spoke of a bloodline that didn't just rule by strength, but by mending, a celestial fire that could purify the void itself. He saw the lineage trees, carefully scrubbed but still legible to those who knew what to look for. The last entry was not a death but a disappearance. A young princess whisked away during the Blackthorn massacre. Calithea was not a rebel. She was the rightful heir to the throne that predated the Pack, the very source of the magic that the Grimhowls had tried to suppress in their rise to power. The revelation was a thunderclap. If the Pack learned that their savior was the ghost of a line they had tried to exterminate, the political foundation of the kingdom would crumble. Rook slammed the book shut, the dust rising in a choking cloud. He had to reach Vaelor before the advisors, or worse, Duke Iskarn, realized the magnitude of what had been brought into the palace. Meanwhile, the upper levels of the citadel were in a state of violent, confused upheaval. The guards who had witnessed the event in the pits had begun to whisper, and whispers in a wolf pack traveled faster than a winter gale. By the time Calithea was brought up from the depths, she was no longer being shoved with the blunt end of a spear. She was surrounded by the Shadow Guard, who moved with a protective, almost reverent formation. She still wore the tattered rags of a prisoner, but as she walked through the marble corridors toward the royal wing, the torches on the walls seemed to flare brighter at her passing. The court had gathered in the great hall, a sea of silk and predatory ambition, all eyes fixed on the doors. When Calithea entered, led by Rook Iron Veil, the murmur of the lords and ladies died as if the room had been plunged underwater. She was a splash of vibrant, solar defiance against the dark, brooding architecture of the Grimhowls. The marks of her shackles were still visible on her wrists, but the skin beneath was unblemished, glowing with that soft amber heat that made the seasoned warriors at the front of the crowd take an instinctive step back. "She is a traitor." Duke Iskarn's voice cut through the silence like a jagged blade. He stood on the dais, his face a mask of calculated outrage, though Rook could see the flicker of genuine panic in the Duke's narrowed eyes. She was caught in the Blackthorn, inciting the fringe dwellers against the king's law. To bring her into these halls, to seat her in the royal wing, is an insult to the blood of every alpha who died to build this throne. Vaelor stepped from behind the velvet curtains of his private chamber, and the room fell into a deathly hush. He was no longer the graying, bent figure they had seen only that morning. He stood tall, his amber eyes clear and burning with a lethal focus. The charcoal rot that had been climbing his neck was gone, replaced by skin that looked as though it had never known the curse. He walked toward Calithea, his gaze never leaving hers, ignoring the frantic protests of his uncle. "She is not a traitor," Vaelor said, his voice a rich, resonant command that vibrated through the floorboards. "She is the only reason the Grimhowl line still breathes. From this moment she is under my personal protection. She will reside in the Solaris suite, and anyone who questions her presence questions my own right to rule." The mention of the Solaris suite, a wing that had been locked and cursed for generations, sent a shockwave through the room. The advisors began to argue, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and political maneuvering. They spoke of the taint of the old blood, the danger of a rival line, and the madness of trusting a captive. But beneath the chaos there was a deeper, more primal undercurrent. The Pack could feel the change in the air. The oppressive weight of the Blight was lifting, replaced by a magnetic, sun-drenched tension that centered entirely on the girl. Calithea stood her ground, her head held high as the court erupted around her. She didn't look at the Duke or the shouting lords. She looked at Vaelor, seeing the man who had tried to crush her and the king who had been mended by her. In the center of the political storm, a silent, romantic gravity began to pull them together. A recognition of two souls destined to clash and combine. The revelation of her royal blood was not just a historical curiosity. It was a declaration of war against the status quo. The prisoner was no longer in the pits, but in the heart of the palace, and the throne was no longer a seat of shadow but a target for the light. Chapter 5. The transition from the iron pits to the Solaris suite was a journey from the belly of a beast to the heart of an ancient dream. Yet for Calithea Nocturne, the gilded walls felt no less restrictive than the rusted bars of her cell. The suite was a sanctuary of white marble and amber glass, a relic of her ancestors that had been scrubbed of its history but could not be purged of its warmth. The air here smelled of sun-drenched cedar and ozone, a stark contrast to the sulfurous rot that permeated the rest of the citadel. It was here, in the quiet hours between dusk and the rising of the predatory moon, that the true weight of her survival began to settle. She was no longer a prisoner of the state, but she had become a prisoner of the king's anatomy. The healing was not a permanent cure. It was a desperate holding action. The blight of the void was an ancient, sentient hunger, and while Calithea's touch could sear the darkness from Vaelor's skin, the rot hid in the marrow, waiting for the light to recede so it could begin its slow, agonizing crawl toward his heart once more. This necessity dictated a ritual that both craved and loathed: daily physical contact. Vaelor, the Alpha King who had ruled through distance and iron-fisted command, was now forced into a state of profound, forced intimacy with the woman he had nearly executed. Every evening, as the shadows grew long and the violet veins of the curse began to throb beneath Vaelor's jaw, he would enter the Solaris suite. He came alone, leaving Rook Ironvale to guard the heavy oak doors, and every time the latch clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room changed. It was as if the very molecules of the air tightened, vibrating with the friction of two opposing bloodlines. Calithea would stand by the window, watching the gray forests of the blackthorn, until the sound of his boots on the marble forced her to turn. "The shadows are restless tonight," Vaelor would say, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to find the frequency of her own pulse. He would discard his heavy furs and the dark leather of his tunic, exposing the broad, scarred expanse of his chest where the charcoal-black decay flickered like dying embers. Calithea would approach him with the cautious grace of a priestess entering a lion's den. She was smaller than him, her head barely reaching his shoulder, but when she raised her hands, the power dynamic shifted entirely. To heal him, she had to do more than graze his skin. She had to press her palms against the seat of the infection, allowing her Solaris fire to bridge the gap between their souls. The first time she touched him in the suite, the tension was nearly unbearable. She placed her hands over his heart and the contact was a physical jolt. Her skin began to glow with a soft, molten amber, and the heat of it radiated through his chest, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the void. Vaelor let out a sharp, ragged gasp, his fingers instinctively curling around her wrists, not to pull her away, but to anchor himself to the only thing in the world that didn't feel like death. "You breathe as if you hate the life I'm giving you," Calithea whispered, her eyes fixed on the point where her glowing fingers met his skin. "I hate the weakness of needing it," Vaelor replied, his eyes hooded, his gaze tracing the curve of her throat. "And I hate that the only thing that saves me is the very blood I was taught to fear." As the days bled into weeks, the sessions grew longer, the silence between them becoming a living thing, charged with a magnetic, simmering heat that had nothing to do with the curse. The physical proximity was a crucible. To maintain the flow of her magic, Calithea had to stay close. Often so close that she could feel the frantic, rhythmic thrum of his heart against her palms and the warmth of his breath against her brow. She became intimately acquainted with the topography of his body, the jagged line of an old sword scar across his ribs, the tension in the muscles of his back, and the way his skin would ripple and burn under her touch. Vaelor, in turn, became obsessed with the nuances of his guardian. He watched the way her golden aura would flare when she was tired, the way her hair smelled of wild honey and storm clouds, and the defiant set of her jaw that never quite softened, even when her touch was at its most tender. He was a king who had known many women but had never known intimacy. He had lived his life as a weapon, but in the Solaris suite he was merely a man being mended by a woman who had every reason to let him break. One night, the rot was particularly stubborn, lashing out from the depths of his ribs like a cornered beast. The pain was so sharp that Vaelor's knees buckled, and he pulled Calithea flush against him to keep from falling. Her hands were trapped between their chests, her glowing light flaring into a brilliant, blinding gold that filled the room. For a long, breathless moment, the healing wasn't just a ritual, it was a total immersion. The barriers of their roles, king and captive, Alpha and Solaris, dissolved into the simple terrifying reality of their skin. Vaelor's breath hitched, his forehead coming to rest against hers. The amber light reflected in his eyes, turning them into pools of molten copper. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heat of their shared heartbeat. He could feel the curve of her waist beneath his palms, and she could feel the raw, primal strength of his body as it finally found peace in her light. "Is this part of the mending, Calithea?" he murmured, his voice a vibration that she felt in her very marrow. "This fire that doesn't just burn the rot but consumes everything else?" Calithea looked up at him, her aura flickering like a dying candle, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The hatred she had carried for the Grimhowl Line was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was being worn away by the sheer, undeniable gravity of the man holding her. She saw the vulnerability in his amber eyes, a crack in the alpha mask that only she was allowed to see. "It is a different kind of decay," she whispered, her fingers trailing up to the base of his throat, where the skin was now smooth and warm. "One that doesn't kill the body but unfastens the mind." He didn't pull away and neither did she. The simmering tension that had been building since that first moment in the iron pits finally boiled over into a silent, magnetic pull. Vaelor leaned in, his lips inches from hers, the Solaris light between them pulsing like a living heart. The world outside, Duke Iskarn's conspiracies, Rook's warnings, the dying kingdom, ceased to exist. There was only the heat, the gold, and the terrifying realization that the Protector and the King were becoming a single, inseparable force. The healing was complete for the night, the violet veins gone, but the physical contact lingered. When Vaelor finally stepped back, his eyes were dark with a hunger that the void could never satisfy. He left the room without a word, but the latch of the door sounded like a declaration of war. Calithea stood in the center of the suite, her hands still tingling with the ghost of his touch, her own light slowly fading into the moonlight. She was the mending and he was the broken, but as she looked at her glowing palms, she realized she was no longer sure who was saving whom. The reluctant guardian had found her charge, but in the process she had found a fire that could not be controlled by bloodline or law. The physical proximity had done what the iron pits could not. It had made the secret princess realize that her heart was as much a battlefield as the kingdom itself. Chapter 6. While the Solaris suite remained a sanctuary of amber light and forbidden heat, the rest of the citadel began to curdle under the influence of a different kind of shadow. Duke Iskarn Blackthorn moved through the corridors of power like a spider sensing a tear in its web. For years he had meticulously cultivated the blight of the void, feeding the Alpha King a slow, rhythmic poison disguised as medicinal elixirs, ensuring that Vaelor's demise would appear to be a natural consequence of a fading lineage. But the reports from his spies within the Shadow Guard had turned from concerning to catastrophic. The king was walking again. The violet rot was retreating. And at the center of this resurgence was the girl from the iron pits, the golden anomaly he had failed to execute. Iskarn stood in his private alchemical laboratory, a room that smelled of hemlock, sulfur, and the cold, metallic tang of dark sorcery. He stared at a vial of concentrated void essence, its contents swirling with a malevolent ink-black life. The poison was being countered by a frequency of light he had thought extinct. To Iskarn, Calithea Nocturne was not just a healer. She was a living testament to the bloodline that had once hunted his ancestors into the caves. If she succeeded in mending Vaelor, the Duke's decades of patient treachery would be incinerated in a single golden heartbeat. He knew that physical blades had failed against her aura, so he turned to a weapon far more insidious, the collective paranoia of the pack. The Duke understood the primal psychology of the Grimhowls. They were a people born of the moon and the hunt, deeply suspicious of any power that did not bark or bite. He began to weave a narrative of the Solar Witch, a creature of ancient deceptive light who had enchanted the Alpha King into a state of bewitched vulnerability. He summoned the lesser lords and the high-ranking soldiers to his chambers, his voice a low, concerned whisper that carried the weight of false paternalism. He spoke of Vaelor's unnatural recovery, of the way the king's eyes had changed, and of the Solaris taint, that was surely a precursor to a total takeover of their ancestral lands. "Look at our king," Iskarn murmured to a group of influential pack elders, his eyes gleaming with a simulated grief. "He no longer consults the council. He spends his nights locked away with a prisoner of the Forbidden Line. Do you truly believe this healing is a gift? Or is it a leash? She is draining the primal strength of the Grimhowls to fuel her own ascension. She is a parasite wrapped in gold, and our alpha is too enchanted to see the teeth at his throat. The seeds of doubt found fertile soil in a kingdom already on edge. The common wolves began to notice the way the light in the Solaris suite burned through the night, a silent, glowing reminder of the witch in their midst. Iskarn's move was calculated to strike when the physical tension between Calithea and Vaelor was at its peak, knowing that the king's distraction would look like a dereliction of duty. To finalize the frame, Iskarn prepared evidence that even Vaelor's most loyal guards could not ignore. He stole a lock of Calithea's hair from her chambers, a strand that still hummed with a faint residual warmth, and placed it within a ritualistic doll carved from cursed blackthorn wood. He then arranged for a series of accidents within the citadel. A guard falling into a sudden catatonic trance, the royal hounds turning on their masters, and a sudden localized blight that withered the gardens directly beneath the Solaris wing. To the untrained eye, it looked like the girl's presence was a magnet for misfortune, a solar flare that was burning the very fabric of the pack's reality. The climax of Iskarn's move occurred during the Feast of the Pale Moon, a traditional celebration where the Alpha King was expected to lead the pack in a ceremonial hunt. Vaelor, feeling the surge of his restored vitality, intended to use the night to prove his strength. But as the moon reached its zenith, Iskarn stepped into the center of the great hall, holding the cursed doll aloft for all to see. "Sire!" Iskarn cried out, his voice cutting through the celebratory music like a funeral bell. "I bring a grievance that can no longer be silenced. While you bask in the glow of your protector, the citadel bleeds. My alchemists have found the source of the recent madness. A sorcery of the old line, a bewitchment designed to hollow you out from within. This girl is not mending you, she is colonizing your soul." The hall erupted in a cacophony of snarls and shouts. Rook Ironveil moved to intervene, but the Duke's men had already fanned out, their hands on their hilts. The collective gaze of the pack turned toward Calithea, who stood beside the throne, her golden aura flickering with a sudden, sharp agitation. She saw the doll, felt the dark, twisted magic Iskarn had infused it with, and realized the trap had snapped shut. The king's uncle was not just attacking her. He was weaponizing the pack's love for their king to destroy the only person who could save him. Vaelor rose from his throne, his amber eyes narrowing as he looked at the doll and then at the accusing faces of his people. He felt the pull of the romance he had been nurturing in the quiet of the Solaris suite clashing with the brutal reality of his crown. The poison master had made his move, turning the healing light into a sinister glare. Iskarn watched with a thin, predatory smile, waiting for the Alpha to choose between his kingdom and his salvation. In that moment, the romantic heat that had simmered between Vaelor and Calithea was tested by the cold steel of political survival. Calithea realized that her touch was no longer enough. She had to survive the court's judgment if she was to ever finish the mending. The shadows Iskarn had summoned were closing in, and for the first time, the girl who could melt iron felt the chill of a betrayal that no solar fire could burn away. Chapter 7. The heavy thud of the iron doors closing on Calithea was a sound that seemed to shatter the very foundations of Vaelor's sanity. Under the pressurized lies of Duke Iskarn and the fearful baying of the council, Calithea had been led away to a high-security isolation chamber, not the filth of the pits this time, but a cold, sterile room of dampening stone that suppressed her solar radiance. Iskarn had played his hand with a master's precision, convincing the pack elders that a temporary quarantine was necessary to investigate the bewitchment. As Vaelor watched her go, his jaw set in a mask of regal indifference to appease his court, he felt the first hairline fracture in his soul. He believed his iron will could sustain him for a night of political maneuvering. He was wrong. The separation acted like a breach in a dam. Without the constant stabilizing hum of Calithea's proximity, the blight of the void didn't just return, it retaliated. It had been suppressed, mocked by her golden light for weeks, and now it surged back with a vengeful, predatory intelligence. Within an hour of her removal, the warmth she had meticulously sewn into Vaelor's marrow began to evaporate, replaced by a cold so profound it felt as though his blood were turning to slush. He sat in his darkened study, his hands gripping the oak desk until the wood splintered, watching in horror as the violet veins erupted across his knuckles with a violent, rhythmic throb. The agony was a different beast tonight. It wasn't just the physical rot eating at his skin. It was a psychological hollow, a yawning abyss where his connection to her had been. Vaelor gasped, his lungs seizing as a shadow viper of pain coiled around his heart. He realized then that the daily rituals in the Solaris suite had done more than just mend his flesh. They had recentered his entire existence. The physical touch, the press of her palms, the scent of summer storm clouds on her skin, had become the only anchor keeping his mind from drifting into the void. He didn't just need her for the cure. He needed her to feel human. Without her he wasn't a king, he was a failing vessel of darkness. Rook Ironveil burst into the room, his face pale as he saw the king slumped over, his skin turning that charcoal gray of the dying. "Sire, the healers are outside but they cannot enter. The Duke has placed a guard on the wing, claiming the quarantine must be absolute to prevent the sorcery from spreading." Vaelor looked up and Rook recoiled. The king's amber eyes were almost entirely consumed by a swirling, chaotic violet. His voice was a guttering candle. "The Duke is a fool. He thinks he is protecting the crown, but he is digging its grave. Rook, I can't hear my own heart anymore. I only hear the void." As the hours crawled toward midnight, the king's condition spiraled into a catastrophic flare. The rot began to weep through his tunic, the dark ink staining the fine fabric as his soul literally began to leak from his body. In the isolation chamber, Calithea felt the shift. Her Solaris blood, faded to his, began to burn with a frantic, agonizing heat. She beat her hands against the dampening stone, her aura flaring in desperate, staccato bursts. She could feel him fading. She could feel the cold fingers of the void wrapping around the man who had looked at her with such terrifying vulnerability in the Solaris suite. Back in the royal chambers, Vaelor was no longer fighting for his throne. He was fighting for the memory of her touch. Every time the darkness tried to pull him under, he summoned the image of Calithea standing by the window, the way her golden light had illuminated the scars on his chest. He realized that the bewitchment Iskarn spoke of was real, but it wasn't a curse. It was the terrifying, undeniable gravity of a fated mate. He had spent his life as a weapon of the Grimhowl, but she had taught him that he could be a man. He needed her presence to remind him that he was worth saving. "Let her out," Vaelor gasped, his body falling from the chair to the floor, his fingers clawing at the rug. "Rook, if she does not touch me, I will become the shadow Iskarn wants." Rook didn't wait for a formal order. He saw the truth in the king's eyes. The realization that Vaelor's heart had moved from his own chest into the hands of the prisoner. The shadow guard turned, his blade unsheathed, ready to cut through Iskarn's quarantine, or die trying. The fracture in Vaelor's soul had revealed the ultimate truth. The Solaris princess and the Alpha King were no longer two separate entities. They were two halves of a shattered world trying to fuse back together. As the king lay on the floor, his breath rattling in a throat clogged with shadow, he realized that if he survived this night he would never let the world put a wall between them again. He would burn the kingdom to the ground before he let her be imprisoned in the dark, for his heart was no longer made of iron, it was made of her light. Chapter 8. The moon-stained altar stood at the highest pinnacle of the citadel, a flat expanse of silver-veined rock that had seen the rise and fall of a dozen dynasties, yet tonight it felt like the very edge of the world. The air was no longer cold. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where the wind itself had been strangled by the arrival of something ancient and hungry. Duke Iskarn stood at the center of the plateau, his robes billowing like wings of charred parchment, the obsidian scepter in his hand glowing with a sickly, rhythmic violet that pulsed in time with the dying heartbeat of the kingdom. He had shed the mask of the concerned advisor. His face was now a map of madness and triumph, his eyes reflecting the churning vortex of the void he had finally summoned from the depths of the Forbidden Realms. Vaelor lay at the edge of the altar, his body nearly consumed by the charcoal rot. He was a shadow of the alpha he had been, his skin cracking to reveal the ink-black nothingness beneath. Rook Ironveil and the remains of the Shadow Guard were locked in a desperate, losing battle against the hushed Iskarn's necrotic soldiers who moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency. Every time Vaelor tried to rise, the violet tendrils of the scepter's power lashed out, pinning him back to the stone. The pack had gathered on the lower ramparts, a sea of terrified, glowing eyes watching as their sovereign was systematically unmade by his own blood. "Look at him." Iskarn's voice roared, amplified by the hollow resonance of the abyss. Look at your alpha clinging to the skirts of a witch. He is the vessel of your ruin. I am the one who brings the peace of the silent night. Into this theater of despair, Calithea was brought, not in chains this time but as a sacrifice. Iskarn's men shoved her toward the center of the altar, intending to use her Solaris blood as the final catalyst to anchor the void permanently to the throne. She looked at Vaelor, her heart fracturing at the sight of his agony. The violet rot had reached his throat, and his amber eyes were flickering like a guttering candle. The romance that had blossomed in the quiet of the Solaris suite, the whispered promises of the mending, and the weight of their shared breaths were all converging on this single brutal moment. Calithea knew that to save him she could no longer play the part of the hidden princess. She could no longer hide behind the rags of a rebel or the silence of a captive. To defeat the void Iskarn had unleashed, she had to become the sun itself, even if it meant revealing her lineage to a pack that had been taught to hate her name. She looked at Vaelor one last time, seeing the man who had found his humanity in her light, and she made her choice. Iskarn, her voice rang out, no longer a chime, but a clarion call that cut through the roar of the vortex. You speak of a silent night, but you have forgotten that the dawn is inevitable. She reached deep into the core of her being, past the fear and the resentment, touching the ancient dormant fire of the Solaris Line. For centuries her people had suppressed this power to survive, but tonight she offered it as a total sacrifice. Calithea threw her arms wide, and the transformation was so violent it shook the very foundations of the mountain. The golden aura that had been a soft hum became a roaring furnace. Her rags didn't just burn. They were vaporized, replaced by a gown of pure woven light that clung to her like liquid gold. Her hair, once dark and matted, flowed upward in a halo of shimmering fire. The mark on her brow, the sunburst entwined with thorns, ignited with a brilliance that turned the midnight sky into a blinding artificial noon. The entire pack fell to their knees, blinded by the sudden arrival of a power they had only known in fairy tales. The Solaris. Rook screamed over the din, a sound of pure, terrified hope. Iskarn's face contorted in a mask of rage. He leveled the obsidian scepter at her, unleashing a wave of pure void matter that looked like a tidal wave of liquid shadow. Die, ghost of a dead world. Calithea didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her bare feet leaving molten prints on the silver-veined rock. As the shadow struck her, it didn't consume her, it shattered. Her light was not a passive shield. It was an aggressive, predatory purity. She grabbed the scepter with her bare hands, the obsidian turning white-hot and exploding into 1,000 harmless shards. The shock wave of the destruction rippled outward, the golden fire chasing the shadows from every corner of the altar, vaporizing the hushed and tearing the violet rot from Vaelor's skin in a single, agonizing, glorious sweep. Iskarn let out a final thin shriek as the light he had feared his entire life consumed him, leaving nothing behind but a scorched shadow on the stone. The vortex vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. Calithea stood at the center of the altar, her glow slowly subsiding into a gentle sunset amber. She was exhausted, her spirit drained by the massive output of magic, but she didn't fall. She looked toward Vaelor, who was gasping for air, his skin clean, his amber eyes bright with a life that was now permanent. She had sacrificed her anonymity. She had revealed the secret princess to the world. But as Vaelor crawled toward her, his hand reaching for hers in front of his entire kneeling pack, she knew that the mending was no longer a secret. It was a revolution. The moon-stained showdown had ended not with the victory of the Alpha or the Solaris, but with the union of the two. In the eyes of her king, Calithea saw not a ruler looking at a protector, but a man looking at the woman who had burned the world to keep him warm. The pack watched in awe as the Alpha King of the Grimhowl bowed his head to the Solaris princess. The old world was dead, and as the true moon began to rise over a kingdom no longer in shadow, the first chapter of their shared reign was written in the gold of the rising sun. Chapter 9. The high spires of the citadel, once shrouded in the suffocating ink of the void, now stood bathed in a dawn that felt less like a daily occurrence and more like a cosmic rebirth. The silver-veined rock of the moon-stained altar still hummed with the residual warmth of the showdown, a silent witness to the moment the shadow of Iskarn Blackthorn had been erased from existence. As the violet vortex dissipated, It left behind an air so crisp and clean it tasted of mountain snow and wild honey. Vaelor Grimhowl rose from the stone, his movements no longer hindered by the grinding agony of the rot. He stood at his full imposing height, the scars on his chest glowing faintly where Calithea's light had stitched his soul back together. He was an alpha restored, but as he looked at the woman standing before him, he knew he was no longer the sole master of this realm. Calithea remained at the center of the plateau, her gown of woven light slowly softening into a simpler radiance, though the mark of the Solaris on her brow continued to pulse with a steady, golden heartbeat. She was the savior of a kingdom that had tried to bury her, the princess of a line that had been turned into a ghost story. The silence of the kneeling pack below was not born of fear, but of a profound collective awe. They had watched a common prisoner transform into a celestial sovereign, and in that transformation the ancient blood debt of the Grimhowls had been settled. The Blight of the Void was not just a curse on the king. It had been a manifestation of the kingdom's own suppressed history, and only the return of the rightful light could have shattered it. Vaelor crossed the distance between them, his heavy boots silent on the silver stone. He did not approach her as a monarch reclaiming his property, but as a man approaching a miracle. When he reached her, he did not demand she kneel. Instead he took her hands, small, warm and still vibrating with power, and brought them to his lips. The contact was no longer a desperate bridge for healing, but a voluntary seal of devotion. The pack elders, including Rook Ironveil, watched from the ramparts as the Alpha King of the Wolves and the Princess of the Sun merged their shadows into a single unified silhouette. The archives will be opened. Vaelor's voice carried over the edge of the altar, resonating with a strength that reached the furthest corners of the city. The names of the Solaris will be spoken again. We have lived in the dark for too long, fearing the very flame that keeps us whole. Today the iron pits are closed forever. The blackthorn shall bloom again, not with poison, but with the grace of the woman who saw a dying king and chose to mend him. The revelation of Calithea's true identity spread through the kingdom like a wildfire, but it did not bring the chaos the advisors had feared. Instead it brought a strange healing peace. The Solaris princess became a symbol of the pack's resilience, a reminder that even the deepest darkness can be purged by a fated touch. Calithea did not hide her heritage. She embraced it, redefining the role of the consort. She was not a mere queen to sit beside Vaelor. She was the protector of the light, the spiritual anchor that ensured the void would never again find a foothold in the Grimhowl bloodline. The royal union was held on the first day of the high summer, beneath a sun that seemed to linger longer in the sky just to witness the event. It was a ceremony of primal strength and solar grace, a blending of the wolf's ferocity and the sun's mercy. Vaelor wore the dark, heavy furs of his ancestors, but they were pinned with a sunburst brooch of dragon glass. Calithea walked to him in a gown that shimmered like liquid amber, her dark hair adorned with thorns and gold. When they joined hands before the pack, the air didn't just warm, it sang. The bond was forged not by political necessity, but by a soul-deep recognition that had survived the iron pits, the rot and the betrayals of a jealous duke. As the years began to turn, the kingdom of the Grimhowl transformed. The grey forests turned vibrant green, the crops yielded a bounty that ended the long famine, and the shadow beasts that once terrorized the prisoners became the loyal guardians of the borders, their void natures tempered by the queen's light. Vaelor and Calithea ruled as a singular force, two halves of a fractured soul finally made whole. The king no longer sat on a throne of shadow, and the princess was no longer a secret. Together, they had become the mending the world had forgotten, a testament to the truth that even a dying kingdom can find its salvation in the touch of the prisoner it once scorned. The story of the Alpha and the Solaris was etched into the very stones of the citadel, a legend of gold and iron that would burn bright long after the last winter had passed. Thank you for listening to this story. Please tell me in the comments section where you are watching from, like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you.